But happy Wednesday, everybody. Good morning. Appreciate you taking the time today. I think this topic is not only timely, but given the fact that Joe Biden made history just yesterday, I think I'm glad that we're having this discussion with the VP pick of Kamala Harris. And so today's topic is really about diversity, inclusion, and I learned last week when we had our pre-call that we should throw in equity too, right, into the mix. So we have a great panel of speakers. I'm thankful, and I'm going to have Michelle Brown, who agreed to moderate this. I'm going to introduce her, and then she's going to kind of kick it off. And the panelists, I think, are going to talk about themselves, and then we'll get right into the topic. Like we normally do on these Zoom calls, we want this to be effective, and we want people to have a takeaway today. And the takeaway is, right, on this topic is go back to your clients, go back to your management. If you are the business owners, what does it mean to have a diversity and inclusion program within your companies, and some actionable items. So it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Brown from Into Action Coaching. She's the founder. She's got more than 25 years experience in executive leadership, business coaching. We had a great event with Michelle last week about how to effectively communicate remotely. So Michelle, thank you for agreeing to moderate, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. This is, as Tony made reference, an incredibly relevant topic. So we are grateful for those who are joining us today. Just to sort of set the context before I pass the mic, so to speak, over to our esteemed subject matter experts. Diversity, now equity, inclusion, they're actually even adding accessibility and belonging, right? Really continues to be a very top priority for workplaces and marketplaces. There's unprecedented things that are happening within the landscape that has really created an even greater sense of urgency that we have around this critical topic. So companies, those of you that are representing your organizations and your businesses, we don't necessarily have a clear and competitive D&I vision. You may, but it may need to be enhanced, or it may need to be created. So our subject matter experts today are going to provide a bit of guidelines and even what some best practices are relative to creating that vision and strategy, where the business goals and the actions can be aligned. And I want to say this now is the time that we need to be impatient and unapologetic in bringing about change. And even as the media may begin to focus in on other areas, and Black Lives Matter and the untimely deaths and murders of quite a number of Black individuals kind of fades into the distance, we need to really maintain a high level of focus and priority around what is happening within our business around diversity, not just racial, but gender, disabilities, etc. So with that said, I'm going to allow each of our panelists today to sort of, take 60 seconds or so to introduce themselves. And I'd like to first start with Stephen Fleischer.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. Good morning. I'm Steve Fleischer. I work at PSEG. I have oversight for the D&I program, talent acquisition, and the operations function within the HR organization. Prior to joining HR and starting to do DE&I work, I was a labor and employment attorney for 20 years. I was always involved with our D&I program and was a big D&I champion. And I was very fortunate when I moved over to HR to have the opportunity to take on that work. Very excited to be here today and to share some of the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Stephen. Lucy Sorrentini.
Sure. Hi, Lucy Sorrentini. I'm the founder and CEO of Impact Consulting. And we are a talent and organizational development consulting firm working with large and mid-sized businesses, specifically in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a business, we've been around for a little bit more than 5 years, headquartered here in New Jersey, but with offices in New York and New Jersey. And in the D&I space, I've actually been an active practitioner, both from an HR perspective and as a chief diversity officer for, I would say, the majority of my career, about 15 years prior to starting my own business. And so this is a space that's near and dear. Michelle, you're right. The definition of what is included in this diversity conversation continues to expand. Dr. Caldwell, I'm actually an alumni of the FDU Executive MBA program. So I participated and attended an incredible program at FDU. So happy to be here with everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Lucy. Dr. Caldwell.
Well, good. Thank you, Michelle. I'm Dale Caldwell. I'm the executive director of the Fairleigh Dickinson University Rothman Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and have the honor to work with Sue Slavin and Maura Panuski, who I think are with us here. In addition, I have a consulting firm, Strategic Influence, that has been in this space and done a lot of consulting and working with a lot of other consultants like Janet Werner and others, focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. I would fail to say my dad, who is recovering, he's in the hospital recovering, is a foot soldier of the civil rights movement and marched with Dr. King and is an expert on this. So I grew up around that, and I lived it in my organizations. I was the first Black senior manager at Deloitte Consulting, started their diversity program 25 years ago. So I've been in this space as a practitioner and a consultant, so honored to be here.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Dave. So to kick things off, and again, just maybe to underscore a bit of what Tony made reference, you know, there are a host of questions that I'm going to pose to our esteemed panelists, but we want to make this perhaps as much as we can interactive and participatory, because those of you on the call today may have questions and actually may even have comments that you want to pose. So we welcome you to write them in the chat. Tony and Nicole and I will be continuing to monitor things that are coming up in the chat, and I'm going to do my best to call them out so that any of your questions or comments can be intermittently addressed. So let's start with sort of strategy development, right? And I'm going to pose this question to you, Stephen. Can you share with us and describe what your company's DEI strategy is and how you're implementing that in the organization?
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. So our strategy is inclusion for all. And the thinking there is that we really wanted to make DEI as relevant and meaningful for as large a portion of the workforce as we can. So if you're trying to drive culture change, one of the key elements is to make sure that it is a meaningful proposition and journey for everybody. So we started with that concept of inclusion for all and helping everybody to realize that they are diverse and what their diversity story is. And in order to bring that to life, we've really boiled it down to a fairly, what I'd like to think is a simple formula. What we're trying to do is to just change the day-to-day experience for employees. We want people to like coming to work. We want them to be happy to come to work. And if you achieve those two things, it really drives the overall culture. And we're coming at that in two ways. We're trying to do that at the peer-to-peer level. So we have 100 or so different locations across a number of different businesses, everything from nuclear energy to delivering electric to finance. And each of those locations and work groups has different needs. So we've established local teams in each location and each work group to identify what their needs are from a DEI perspective, and we will support that from a corporate perspective. So we have a partnership. So the local teams tell us what they need. We help them with strategy. We help them develop and build programs, and vice versa. When we have corporate initiatives that we're looking to push out, they help us tailor those in a way that'll work for their location and their work group. And we're trying, so at the local level, to change that peer-to-peer interaction. The other thing that we're trying to do is to improve the manager-employee experience. And what we're doing there is we're focusing heavily on inclusive leadership and developing the inclusive leadership skills. That's been a key priority for us. We want all our leaders to be inclusive and to create an inclusive workplace. So our thinking is that if we come at it from that manager level and that peer level, we can drive that culture change and drive that improved experience that we're looking for.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as an executive coaching talent management organization, we're finding that a lot of our clients and even prospects are, in some instances, either at ground zero with their strategy or literally trying to determine what they can do to ensure that it's sort of systemic. So this follow-up question, I'm going to point to you, Lucy. What advice do you, kind of as a consultant, have for companies that may be beginning their DEI journey?
Awesome. Yes, I would say first, be patient with yourself. It's a process. Also be willing, very willing to be vulnerable, in that part of this is around self-awareness and sharing what you know and equally what you don't know with your community, with your team, with your business. And also listening, huge part, basic stuff, but it starts with us, right? Always self-awareness. Who are we? How much do we know about this topic? How comfortable are we discussing certain elements of the topic? What does our network look like? How will our network support us? Who are the staff? Who are the employees, the leadership that make up our organizations? How much do we know about them? How willing are we to listen, to really listen? And then being patient with putting together the various piece parts. And so, to me, strategy evolves as you really begin to think about this topic from the perspective of the business. So, we're all in business to run, manage, lead a business, right? Contribute. And so giving thought to where does diversity fit in to the business, and then very quickly aligning that to the employee experience. And what we typically say is think about the employee life cycle, how you attract, how you develop, how you engage, how you reward, and how you retain your staff. Think about that from the perspective of anything and everything we do as individuals, as managers and leaders influence that talent life cycle. And so just being able to really understand and connect back to, and where does diversity, equity, and inclusion fit? What's working, what's not working based on what you're hearing. And then starting from that biggest pain point, maybe even the place that you feel most uncomfortable, I would say attack that one first. Definitely proceed and attack that one first. And lastly, leadership and manager engagement. In that, as an HR practitioner, as a business leader, it's one thing to do it on your own. It's another thing to have, leaders supporting it, and actually leaders helping to lead the way and set the example.
Excellent. I really liked what you described, Lucy, in terms of sort of a cycle, because that, even from a strategic perspective, enables organizations to look at, from recruitment to developing employees to keeping them engaged, right? Because that's the retention piece. Absolutely. To rewarding, and then ultimately, with whatever their tenure may be, all the way through to retirement. What can be done within an organization to ensure that DEI is an essential element, at each of those phases, so to speak. Love that. So I'm going to direct this to you, Dr. Caldwell. We hear these terms: diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging. But just to sort of ground us, can you help us understand what the differences are between those, or what the definitions are, simplistically?
Well, thank you, Michelle. One of the things that I like to say is that really the order of diversity, inclusion, and equity is really DIE. And it's DIE, but that's not a great acronym. So DEI is a whole lot better. But this whole idea, and having lived it, is diversity. Do we have, and that's oftentimes a numbers thing. Do we have a certain percentage of folks? And I have some friends at the NBA, and at the NBA, you have 80% of the players, 75% of the players are Black, yet about 13% of the administrative staff. So from a diversity standpoint, if you look at the whole organization, you say it's diverse. Well, people realize that is not sufficient, that just because you have numbers is not enough. So really inclusion, how do you include these folks in the leadership of the organization, include them in the operations of the organization, and so that they have a role? So some companies have done some organizations have done better than others, but this idea of equity. So once you've included them, is it equitable? Is it equitable across them? Do we have a representation? All the research points to the fact that diverse teams perform better than monolithic teams. And so what's happening now in the business world is that it used to be largely just white male only. So command and control ruled, where people, I like to say people would say jump, and then people would say how high. Well, now we have a much more diverse world where diversity is the rule, not the exception. So leaders often say jump, and people say, I'm busy, why don't you jump? I'm not, I don't have the same approach. So equity is really about taking that to the next level and looking at where we are. One of the things that I'll talk about a little later is this thing that I call the racial inclusion sensitivity. That so often companies are colorblind. They say, oh, well, we don't look at color. We hire the best. But what happens is they lack diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so when I say inclusion sensitivity is if you're sitting in a room and there are only white men in the room, Are you sensitive enough to ask the question to the leadership, where is diversity? So that's one of the things we're pushing, is to open people up to this idea of really being sensitive to reality. And we can talk some more about that.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Racial sensitivity. Yeah, yeah. I'm going to go back to you, Stephen. You know, very impressive what you are leading the organization regarding DEI strategy and implementation. How has that strategy changed due to COVID?
Yeah, it's it's ever evolving, but I would say that what we've done with COVID really falls into three buckets. It's what we've added, where we've pivoted, and where we've looked for opportunities to actually leverage the situation to further the DEI work. So in terms of things we've added, you know, COVID has posed some very specific challenges in the DEI space and has impacted certain communities harder than others. So for example, you know, the Pan-Asian community has been victimized in all of it through, you know, misinformation that's being spread. So we joined with many other companies to sign a pledge showing support for the communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And we also enlisted one of our employee business resource groups to do a lunch and learn for the Pan-Asian community to talk about the misconceptions and, you know, just to have that dialogue because we felt that that was an important thing to do. In terms of where we pivoted, we took a look at our existing strategy and decided where we could do things that would be more effective in a virtual environment. So for example, we have a number of employee business resource groups and they do all sorts of great programming and events. We went to one of those groups and said, you know, a third of our workforce, half of our workforce is now working from home and there's social isolation there. What can you do for those people? And one of our resource groups stepped up and they put together a toolkit for people working from home and how to be effective. And they put together virtual lunch and learns to create that social connection and to talk about how to be effective in the workplace. And then in terms of trying to look for opportunities, people were very focused on COVID, and where you had that focus, it was a good opportunity to get some DEI messaging and work done as well. So at the start of the pandemic, we had a daily message coming out from our COO, and that was the one thing you could guarantee that everybody was reading. It showed the statistics for the corporation and how many people were positive and how many people were returned to work and our business planning and our contingency planning. So everybody was reading that message. So I took the opportunity to put DEI messaging and awareness in those communications because I knew everybody was going to read those. So we also looked for those opportunities that even though the pandemic was so consuming and overwhelming, to still use that to get the DEI work done.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Stephen. Lucy, you know, you come with a plethora of, I'm sure, experience and exposure, given that you're a consultant to a number of organizations or many organizations. And my question is this, you know, certainly we're experiencing it with our client base as well. There's internal focus in terms of what DEI looks like internally within an organization, as well as externally, what an organization should be doing from a corporate social responsibility, even potentially a philanthropic perspective. So if you could, can you share some kind of key DEI industry trends that organizations might, you know, be looking to be aware of?
Absolutely,
Maybe from an
absolutely.
internal as well as an external perspective.
Happy to. Some of what we work with our clients, and sometimes we bring it to them, and sometimes they're light years ahead on their D&I journey, so they already have evolved the program. But much of what we say includes very much an integrated model or a system. You talked about the talent lifecycle system in response to diversity, equity, inclusion from an internal perspective. There's also an element that integrates what we focus on, which is the workforce. So really understanding deeply who the workforce is and the composition of your workforce, the workplace, the discussion around inclusion, and the systems that you've embedded internal to ensure that from a workplace perspective, you are in fact increasing your opportunities for inclusion and creating a welcoming space for everyone. And then the marketplace, which for us is not only about the external brand, the external positioning of the company, but also how the company shows up from a community perspective. And so from our vantage point, working with our clients, and by the way, many of them already have these elements, they're just not connected. Even supplier diversity, right? It's in there, it's just not connected and talked about as one system. And so this notion of ecosystem in consulting speak, which, you know, we've been using that term quite a bit for many years, is this notion that says, we're doing it anyway. In some cases good, in some cases not so good, but we're doing it anyway. We're already spending money. We already have resources allocated. We've already made our commitments. We have functional teams established and aligned to support these different entities. What we need to do now is take a step back and find a way to bring them, connect them all, and bring them together. And so what we're finding is companies that tend to advance more quickly are those companies that have figured out how to connect those dots, number one, and that they have secondarily as part of that a more holistic view of what does success look like. And it's the little wins, right? It's not always the bold goal, that's gonna come, but it's incremental changes along the way and what that would look like. From a community perspective, very specifically, what we're finding is engaging with communities. Several of our clients are nonprofits, right? So Newark Alliance, of which I know CIANJ, you're a participating partner. Newark Alliance happens to be our client. And we work with Newark Alliance and the participating companies that support the Alliance, all of whom are headquartered in Newark, to begin to discuss how we can expand our diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, engagement, and strategy to connect back with the community. Because guess what, in the city of Newark, as an example, we have amazing talent, professional talent who also happen to be of color, many of whom are Black professionals who back in the day when we can travel to New York, right, were commuting to New York instead of working in Newark, working in Newark proper. You know, when given the chance, why would we not want to bring those individuals into the fold and have them work in the same community where we live, right, where they live? And so part of what we're doing is really connecting that to say the community efforts, while they're great from a feel-good perspective, because it's always wonderful to support community opportunities from a social responsibility perspective, there's also an opportunity to find viable talent and also an opportunity to increase your corporate reputational brand. And so for me, the biggest takeaway is really finding an opportunity to connect those for companies and then just really tweaking the model so that you're incrementally adding to the benefit of what's already been done. And in some cases, pulling out what's not working, because we do know there are those elements that are not working. And we have historically just, you know, added on, but not necessarily taken a step back and done an inventory to assess what's working and what's not. Mm-hmm. So a long answer to the question. I hope I answered it, but the key there is around connecting all the various piece parts to include the workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace.
Awesome. Yeah, to ensure that the strategy is fully integrated and not
Absolutely.
sort of compartmentalized and fractured. Got it, fragmented. So it's interesting. I'm going to point this question to you, Dr. Caldwell. You know, organizations certainly now, because of the heightened awareness around, you know, the injustices and the racism that, you know, has become, unfortunately, is still alive and well. Organizations that have sort of purpose-driven values and a moral compass are aligned with it. However, with organizations that need to generate profit for their own sustainability, a lot of questions are posed to how diversity, inclusion, and equity can increase the profitability of a business. So can you help us sort of understand that connection?
Absolutely, Michelle. Before I do, one, I'm happy Lucy's working with, I actually was the founding executive director of the Newark Alliance. So I'm actually pleased to see the Newark Alliance is doing well and growing. And so with your talent involved, I'm excited about that. Michelle, that's a great question. And that's really the operative question. You know, is there a bottom line value to diversity, inclusion, and equity? And you know, as I mentioned before, the research shows diverse teams perform better, but how does that return, what's the return on investment of that? Well, the reality is that diversity is the rule, not the exception. And so there are a couple things that are happening here. From a global perspective, the young talent now, because of their influences, want to work for companies that are not only doing well economically, but are doing good in the community. So from a hiring perspective, companies, you're seeing companies that never cared about, I'm seeing a lot of Wall Street companies actually being much more socially conscious because they want to recruit this next generation of folks. So from a bottom line, hiring the best talent, really being a company that's known to be committed to DEI is really, really important. Secondly, I do a lot of work with teams. I'm working with Under Armour and some others to really do team building. And when you don't have teams that are diverse, I see a shortage of creativity and effectiveness. I see that many of those teams are thinking very much in the same way. One of the things, I wrote a book called Intelligent Influence, and people who know me know I use this framework called Intelligent Influence where we're all products of our influence. One of the mistakes that a lot of companies make is that they are looking at top down, the external view, but it's really about the people and their influences. And if you don't deal with the influences of the people on your team, you're never going to be able to have them be fully engaged and be as effective as possible. So when you start to really do it that way, you start to see how people become so much more engaged. They're more willing to go above and beyond the call of duty for companies that have true diversity. And then if you look at sales teams, one of the things, and what I teach really is empathy. And that empathy is actually the #1 business skill, because if you're selling to a client, you have to empathize with where they're coming from. If you're working with your boss, you have to empathize with where she or he is coming from. If you're working with folks, if you have a team working for you. So when you begin to tie these supposedly soft things into it, and you look at the companies that are doing it, their bottom line reflects it. Now, there have been some studies and some research to show that, but frankly, I don't know that there's been as good a study as there needs to be to really show the direct correlation with diversity, or even more importantly, to show how you lose revenue by not being diverse, by being monolithic. So.
No, that you just, you hit the nail on the head, because oftentimes organizations are not recognizing what their loss is. Mm-hmm. They're looking for what the return on investment is from a bottom line perspective, but not recognizing that when there's low performance, low productivity, what's the cost to the business? And by having a pretty strong and sustainable DEI strategy in place that's ongoingly implemented can actually, bring about some cost savings. Yeah. Well said. So I just want to pause for a minute, and I don't see anything in the chat, but I want to give any of our participants an opportunity to unmute themselves to ask any of our panelists a question or to make a comment before we continue with the questions. We got a quiet group.
I mean, I could kick it off, Michelle. One of the things is, what's the most difficult part of a DEI program? I mean, is it getting started? How do you measure it? What's, in your opinions, what's the most difficult part of a DEI program?
I mean, I'm happy to start. I think from my vantage point, it's when the leaders themselves, so the leadership, and you define who that is, whether it's the chief executive officer or 1 or 2 levels down, when they themselves are potentially not as self-aware around their organizational realities. And so there's an element about, we have it written up on our core values. We talk about it all the time. Of course, it's important to us, right? Of course, it's important to us. And of course, I'm committed to it. Which are the words, but then the realities are what is actually happening in the organization is far from that. And that's an okay thing, right? That happens to the best of us. But to me, the issue is when you're not realizing it, right? Because if you realize it, you can change it. But if as a result of bias or something else, you're not realizing it or you're not willing to confront it, that to me is the biggest hurdle. Once we sort of penetrate that, the rest of it, quite frankly, is workable. But it's really that initial piece that's most critical.
And I'd like to add the time is, Tony, that's a great question, because time is so important. Because what happens is people say, I believe in it, but I don't have time to do it. you know, I'm focused on the bottom line. I gotta generate my quarterly profits. I've got to do this. But they don't understand that you actually lose time by not investing in this in the long run. And that's their excuse, is that I do it, but I just don't have time to try to do this. And so I'm curious to hear Stephen's answer, because he's living that. He's living the difficulty of this.
I'd like to make a comment before you guys go further, if it's okay.
Sure.
I'm Carithia Oates. I'm actually a portfolio manager and financial advisor at Morgan Stanley, and I've been as of
No.
Nope, we lost.
My signal.
Street for 2 years, because when I joined Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter back then, I also joined Commerce and Industry before they abandoned us in our building, right, Tony?
Yeah.
So my point, my point is that I am an anomaly. Good morning, Michelle. Nice to see you. The challenge with this conversation around diversity and inclusion is that typically the same people are sitting at the table that have decision-making capabilities, and they don't tend to look like me. I've been very fortunate and blessed that I work at Morgan Stanley, because we have a large number of African-American or Black managing directors and leadership at my firm. And they just gave like $5 million to NAACP to put our money where our mouth is. And, you know, we work hard to support and encourage Black and minority and other. I'm really focused on the Black paradigm, because that's what I am. And it's been neglected for so long. So there's so much that needs to be done with this systematic racism we've experienced. I don't honestly know where to start. However, everything I do, I support Black business. I started a group called Bergen County Black Business Network, which Michelle used to be a member, and we're working on launching a Black Business Network forum from Commerce and Industry. And literally, I put my money where my mouth is. I used to work with Michelle as I hired her as a coach. My makeup woman is a Black women-owned business. The woman that does my wardrobe is a Black women-owned business. My dermatologist is a Black women-owned business. Talking about it is not going to make much change if we don't put our dollars with it. And my belief is when we can move the market, the stock market I'm speaking of, if we can move the needle in the stock market, then we will see diversity and inclusion. But until then, until we're not building wealth as a community, it's just conversation. We need to actually put activity behind that conversation. I'm not saying no one on this panel isn't putting activity behind it, but overall, I'm the only Black female financial advisor in Bergen County for any major brokerage firm. And Bergen County is the second wealthiest county in New Jersey, maybe the country. And we have 1 million people here. We're the largest county in the state. And based on demographics, the state and the country have 12% Blacks, where Bergen County only has 5% Blacks. So we need to make a change here in Bergen County and spread it across the state, spread it across the country.
Well said, well said. And I think, you know, you underscore the value of conversations like this, because those of us that are on this call want to be part of the change, right? We don't want to allow the status quo to continue. So thank you for sharing that, Carithia. Well said. And it actually draws to a comment that was posed in the chat by Andrea Dudo, if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. And it sort of is an element of what Carithia just referenced. And, you know, it's about asking management or whatever, you know, whether it's the owners or board, where is diversity? You know, it could be scary actually posing that question. So I want to ask any of the three of you, you know, any suggestions that you have that would help us understand how to lead into that question, or you know, how to broach that subject. Where is diversity?
Well, first, I mean, one of the things, going back to this racial inclusion sensitivity, it's really just inclusion sensitivity, because it could be gender inclusion. So for example, I'm looking at this call, and probably 80% of the folks are women here, which is wonderful. But I think it's important that all of us become sensitive to the environment that we're in. And so I think the first step is making people sensitive to the environment in a very positive way. I've learned that you can't really attack anybody. You can't really use the R word. You can't it's really, and it's about influence. And so I use the influence framework to really have difficult conversations, because at the end of the day, I could sit with someone who was in the Klan. They weren't born racist, but I can ask them, well, how many Black people and how many Jewish people have you met? And they say, well, I haven't met any, but I know they're bad. And so having that conversation about influence. And so the trick that I use is this. I ask people who've been successful, say the CEO of a company that's not very diverse. I say, Joe, you're really successful. Who are the influences in your life? And they'll say their nanny and their CEO dad and their tennis pro and priest or whoever. Who do you think are the influences in the lives of the company? And the amazing thing is they've never thought about that. They go to a room with people that look just like them, and it's not because they're racist, it's that that's what they know. But when you begin to start asking that question, people say, well, I never thought about that. And so we've got to get people to have that conversation, but we as people have to be very sensitive to inclusion in everything that we do and kind of call it out in a nice way. That's for big and small businesses.
No, you're absolutely right. It's interesting with a lot of the work that we're doing within organizations as they are either starting or continuing their DEI strategy. These things called conversational forums or listening tours are what we are highly recommending that senior management, we start with senior management, right? These are very uncomfortable conversations to have. Bringing up racism, or the lack of diversity within an organization can really be very polarizing. But when we, with a facilitation, allow these conversations to be had, for them to be brave and in some instances sort of safe environments, it sort of dispels the uncomfortableness and just kind of allows the big pink elephant to be exposed in the room. So that is absolutely a way that we can start having the conversations and bringing a heightened level of awareness.
Yeah, I want to add also that I think so interesting that, the external environment and landscape being what it is, right? And sort of has created on one end, this really sore, sad, painful spot for many of us, painful almost in the heart, very deep. And for those individuals of color and Black leaders, even more so. So on one end, not a good place to be. On the other end, a great place to be, because to be honest with you, I am hearing conversations now that we have not had. I've been doing this stuff for nearly 20 years, focusing in this space. Back in the day when the diversity conversation was all around compliance, if you can believe that, it's based on what's, the checkbox for what's required to do, as opposed to the right thing to do. More people are listening. So even the conversation or the question that was asked in the chat about it's difficult, it's hard not to turn on news or media or have a conversation where this topic isn't being discussed. And so what I would say is, and I'm happy to share with the group, we have some teaser questions, but this is our opportunity to raise it, whether it be from the context of personally, here's how I'm thinking about it or feeling about it, from a business perspective, hey, just curious, I'm sure you're tuned into the news. As a company, what are we doing? How can I help? Put yourself in the position of both asking the question, as any good coach, Michelle knows as any good coach would, right? Ask the right questions. And I can promise you more people are listening, more business leaders that you otherwise would have thought aren't paying attention or don't care or it's not a priority. They actually do care and they're concerned because they're not quite sure how to deal with it. And so, again, not easy, but definitely I think easier because you have more of a captive audience now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was fascinated, Dale, by your lineage, your dad, and his role as sort of a foot soldier during the civil rights movement. Can you just share with us as a bit of background, what he thinks about this current discussion?
Well, again, I preface that with my favorite picture is a picture of my dad, Ralph Abernathy, and Dr. King. Ralph Abernathy was kind of Dr. King's second in charge of the civil rights movement. And they actually were in Boston in 1965 to integrate the Boston public schools. And so he was in Selma, he was on the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And so one of the things that he always says is that, we're making progress. And so this is one thing that people don't realize is that, and this is why I say empathy is important, because everyone who's Black that I know has been stopped by the police inappropriately. Just again, it happened all the time. And so So the video, but there wasn't videotaped. Now things are being videotaped and the world is aghast, but it's actually better now than it was before. Yeah. But now that people know about it, and it's led to these conversations. But one of the things that we don't talk about is there are a couple things, and one is poverty. And so I'm obsessed with getting rid of poverty, because in America we shouldn't have poverty, because you don't have to care about poor people. But if poor people have a job and money, then rich people become richer. So it's just a basic, and there's an intersection between race and poverty and the police and all that stuff. So that's a whole piece of it. But then there's this other piece of the realities of America, and Kamala Harris, it's amazing. She's an amazing person. She's an amazing U.S. senator. But there is a disconnect in the Black world between those whose parents have come from islands or Africa and those who've been here for multi-generations. And it's because of influence. Because if you come, I've never met a Black bank president of a white institution. So even as an African-American who went to Princeton and Wharton and has got his doctorate, I don't know that I could ever be a bank president of a white bank. But you come from Africa, you come from Jamaica, you see that you can be anything you want. And if you started to dissect the Blacks that are being successful in America and on Wall Street, many of them are not multi-generational African-Americans. And so if you pull that out, it's a very dismal story in America, and it doesn't have to be that way. And so my thing is not to make people feel guilty, but to have that conversation and transparency. Anyone who knows me knows that I believe in transparency with my heart and soul. I think that if we started to really look at transparency at everything from employment and small businesses and the economy and politics and other things, what we're seeing in the police is transparency. And so I think we need to ask for transparency of companies, and in addition with their diversity spend. And so when you look at all this stuff, that's what my dad is saying, is that we've taken that first step, kind of the obvious racism, but now we're trying to move to this next level, which is a little more nuanced and a little more difficult. But these are the kinds of conversations, and I thank Tony and CIANJ, that will get us further along.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well said. There's an interesting question that was posed by Donna Bernard. I'm going to call you out, Donna. I think this was really kind of interesting. And we're talking a lot about, diversity, equity, inclusion within sort of a workplace from a business perspective, but we're also making reference to change has to happen at any level of our life cycle, right? We've got kids in school now who, grew up in a different time than we may have. So the question is, and I'll pose this to any of the panelists, how can we work with the school population to, bring about influence in what is being taught and how children of all races are recognizing the realities? Because as a woman born in the 60s, and certainly even my son is 25, Black history was not really part of the core curriculum. It was a dedication, in February, Black History Month, but when he was attending and when I was attending history class, a lot of the contributions and the things that did not necessarily make America great, extracted a lot of history in terms of what Blacks and other minorities and other people with disabilities, doesn't matter, and even from a gender, what women were doing. So again, to make a long story short, what could we be doing to ensure that from an academic perspective, what kids are learning really helps to bring about systemic change?
Yeah, Michelle, I can speak a little bit about what we're doing and what we're planning to do. So currently we partner with the Newark schools and we attend different events to talk to the school population about a career in energy and what that might involve. And, it's a really great career path that not a lot of people think of. So that's one thing that we're doing. Where we want to go next is that we want to build pipeline programs where we're getting to school kids early on in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade and having a well-established program where we identify kids who might be interested in a career in energy, and we follow them through the life cycle, through their educational life cycle, and have opportunities waiting for them when they're done, whether it's after high school or after college, And throughout that process, we provide support and, different resources that they might need to be successful. But I think it's a really wonderful opportunity and mechanism to, impact school-age children early on in their academic careers.
Yeah, Lucy, Dale, do you want to chime in on that as well?
Well, I'm
Donna,
president of the Brunswick Board of Education. I was head of a charter school, and so one of the things, and this continues your question about the civil rights movement, one of the things that's really important is that so often when we talk about diversity, we're talking about people being subjugated, people, Black people being abused and so on, which is critically important. But we also need to celebrate those Black folk that have risen above some of these things. So I actually started 3 halls of fame. I started one called the Black Entrepreneurs Hall of Fame, the Black Inventors Hall of Fame, and the Black Tennis Hall of Fame. And I did the tennis first and saw we needed those 2. And so if I mention the name Onesimus, probably nobody here really knows this name Onesimus. Well, Onesimus was a slave who got freedom in Boston, and he actually invented the process that helped to cure smallpox. So as we're sitting here with the vaccine, the need for a vaccine, a slave actually did that. And so I can give a list of also, and so the whole idea is to celebrate those people who are Black, who are of color, who have been overlooked by the history books. Nobody reads about them in their history books. And why is that important? Well, it's important because it gives confidence. And I think we don't understand the lack of confidence that a lot of young people of color have in being everything that they can be. That often we think that, well, you put a scholarship out in Newark and the kids are going to jump for it. No, they don't know anybody who went to college. They don't see the value of that. So we need to really begin. This is why I keep going back to empathy. We have to empathize with the people we work with our communities, and try to wear their moccasins to understand where they're coming from. And so when you put those kinds of heroes, I mean, Michael Jordan's a great hero and so on, but they're business people. They're people who have made history that I think we need to infuse into our school system, which we currently don't do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to, before I give a comment, Don, I know you were trying to get in, so I think you posed the question.
I was going to say, I'm Donna Bernard, and I am Jewish. And in 1972, I was in one of the first classes at Bayside High that brought in desegregation and was busing kids in from Jamaica. And it was, high school is chaos in the first place. And I had moved from the suburbs into an urban environment because we lost all our money and we moved to this area and figured out how to survive. And you would think, I know lessons that we've learned in the years of desegregation that we don't use today or have utilized today. The second point is, as Tony knows, Newark school systems are near and dear to my heart because there's 65 schools with the average age of the buildings being 95 years old and crumbling. So was late to the call because I was on a call to discuss the Newark and the city school projects from an environment, workforce development, student involvement. So I actually have a plan that I'm working with to try to make an impact. So I think at the core, it starts with our young students. And I think the pandemic has amplified the miserable living situation that we can no longer accept when we walk by these old crumbling buildings with no air conditioning or not working, with mold and paint, and then expect children to learn and then come out healthy. So I am working with a company, and CIANJ has a social impact project that I'm starting to participate. So I invite you to join me on this, because I think we have to, if we can get into the root of education, then we can really make an impact. And, I know, Carithia, I have a perfect board that I would love you to be on, and I will talk to you about that, because I think we have to not wait to be asked. I think we have to say what board we will be on. So that's all I wanted to say. I jumped on a little late, but I'm very passionate about this because Dr. Caldwell, when we talk about racism, I'm Jewish and was often talked about as a Jewish woman with a career. So thank you.
No, thank you. Lucy, was there
I
something
wanted,
you wanted to
yeah,
say?
I guess I wanted to add, when I heard the question, what came up for me almost immediately was the education, the conversation starts at home.
Mhm.
It really does start at home. So before I even send my kids off to school, and granted they're older now, right, 18 and 21, but I realized even for me, right, I was first generation here in the US. My parents are American also, but born and raised in Puerto Rico. And so the first thing that happened when they came over was we stopped speaking Spanish, we speak English, right? And when you're home, you're maybe not hearing, in my case, as much about the culture, as much about what it means to be Puerto Rican and some of those amazing stories that Dr. Caldwell, you and others have shared. I don't know that I remember that many stories about my own heritage, right? And so part of it then is what gets translated to my kids. And so what's pretty incredible is literally, like I said, I've been in this diversity space for a long time, but it really hasn't been until I would say the past 3 years that as a family, we've been having some of these crucial conversations at home because I had compartmentalized it. It was my job and then it was my family. And I think that needs to stop. This is about us every day. And so I think we all need to lean into, no matter where we are, no matter who we are and where we come from, this diversity conversation needs to be around the dinner table, needs to be part of what we engage in as a family and talk about as a family. And so to me, that's where we start our kids off, beginning to ask questions, beginning to get curious, beginning to maybe push back when they hear things that don't feel like what they're hearing at home, right? There's that misalignment. So I would absolutely say let's advocate for more conversation at home.
Michelle, can I add to that?
Of course.
And the talk, one of the terms that I've coined having done this is called urban traumatic stress disorder, that when I was running a charter school in Trenton, that many of the students had what looked like post-traumatic stress disorder, but it wasn't post because they went to a beautiful school, then they went back home and they came back. And the same neurological amygdala challenges that they had. So mindfulness, sports like tennis and others really were helpful. But one of the things that I've learned about schools, as much as I've been in education, because I've been on the school boards for 23 years, is that the best thing we can do is, because parents in that conversation, Lucy, is so important at home, and this is why I'm so into entrepreneurship, is to create jobs for parents. I would rather have jobs for parents where they can pay their bills so they can advocate for their kids than anything else.
Absolutely.
Because if you can do it, right now parents are juggling 2 or 3 jobs or unemployed. They can't focus on their kids' education. And so when entrepreneurship, so we and even big companies should support entrepreneurship in urban communities. And Tony knows I'm recommending some legislation on something called entrepreneur zones, where investors get tax credits to invest in entrepreneurial businesses in the poorest sections of the community. And I'm doing that not just because of business, but because of education, because they're going to hire people who can really advocate for their kids. So it all comes back to business, and it all comes back to businesses understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Absolutely. So I know we're approaching the top of the hour. Tony, do you want to sort of close this out and any closing comments?
I just want to say, wow, what a conversation. I mean, this has definitely held my attention for the last hour. So let's do this. I think this is not a one event and done kind of thing. I think we ought to continue to dialogue and think of other topics. So on that note, I'll work with Nicole and the team and through the HR forum and other forums to really come up with some additional events. So I want to thank you, Michelle, Lucy, Stephen,
Sure.
Dr. Caldwell, and also everybody for staying on the call. And hopefully you have some good takeaway items here, because again, I think raising the awareness is important, but there has to be action, right? And I think that's the key, that we take this, what we learned today, and use it and live it. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well. And another plug for our afternoon, if you are in the marketing side of things, one of our engineering firms is going to do a super group, which is a new concept in marketing where you pool your resources with other groups, and that's at 2 o'clock today. And tomorrow we have a manufacturing event. So I'll look forward to seeing you at the next virtual event.
That's great. Thank you.
And by the way, this was recorded. So if anybody wants a link, just contact me or Nicole and we'll send you the link. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Michelle, thank you. Steve and Lucy.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.